Zach Schoffstall. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, partner. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, absolutely. And first order of businesses, I must thank Steve Murphy, Murph, over at the Game of Crimes for the introduction. We had lunch about 3, 4 weeks ago, and we touched on this, and I think it's very important that we do talk about this because you were done dirty. There's no nice way of putting it. Sometimes in military and also police, you hear blue on blue. That's usually when a fellow law enforcement officer, you know, accidentally shoots somebody or does great bodily harm to another law enforcement officer. But, we're not trained for the psychological effects of this. But what happened to you was far worse, in my opinion. There was great malice and prejudice by your leadership. How do you deal with that?
Well, you're definitely not trained for it. I mean, I was,
Right.
in the military, in the law enforcement. I was an active shooter instructor, a tactical instructor, fire instructor, SWAT operator. You prepare your mind and your body for a violent confrontation. You don't prepare yourself for a, you know, notionally violent confrontation with your own organization. And it is a difficult road, and your mind's not prepared for it. You're emotionally not prepared for it, and you just kind of got to fumble your way through. And I think that's why a lot of guys succumb to that pressure. They break, they start drinking, they do dumb
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's hard not to fault somebody because, like what you just said, we're not trained for that. We're trained for all kinds of stuff. We're trained for, like you said, active shooters, people trying to harm us, then, there's a lot of talk about PTSD, and we're doing better at handling that as organizations than we did 30 years ago, when I started on the job. Before it was like, suck it up, buttercup, that's the thing. But when I heard your story, I did some digging. And at first, I'm hesitant to bring on anybody who said they were done wrong by their department because 90% of the time it's BS. A lot of times it's like, you need to look in the mirror, buddy, or gal, or
Sure.
whoever. I would have coppers, I was a sergeant. I would have coppers like, Sarge, the department's so corrupt. Oh, it's so corrupt. And I'm like, well, that's a big word. And that's that reminds me of throwing, taping up drug dealers and throwing them in Lake Michigan, doing stuff like that, or taking money
Sure.
from drug dealers, or whatever. So, and 99% of the time it was like, well, I didn't get overtime, but Jane did instead of me because she's friends with the captain. I'm like, that's not corruption. Is it? It's unfair, but it's not corruption, and you still have a job. You're still going to get a pension. So I'm very careful about that. So I wanted to put that out there on the front end. And, from everything that I've researched, you're 100% in the right, and people need to hear your story. So that's why I'm doing this. But let's start at the beginning. How does a kid from Montana who was thinking of becoming a race car driver become an FBI agent?
Yeah. I think like a lot of folks, when I was in high school, I didn't have a real clear vision of where I wanted to go. I decided to go to trade school instead of going to college for a 4 year degree initially. And, I was very mechanically inclined. I liked working on cars. My family business was a firearms manufacturing business. So it made logical sense for me to go and get a couple of associate degrees. One was in engineering at the associate's level, which is mostly design work,
Okay.
and then an associate's degree in machine trades. So, design it and make it. When I finished those programs, I had folks in my ear saying, you've got a lot of college credits. You should at least go and get your bachelor's in mechanical engineering, which I subsequently started, but it wasn't where my heart was, wasn't where my passion was. And I was, in my early 20s, I was like 21 or 22 at that point, and was just kind of losing my way.
Yeah.
I transferred to Montana State. I did have all these college credits. So I was like a quasi sophomore, junior. And it's thermodynamics and strength of materials and differential equations and all these classes that just suck for everybody that goes through those programs, and it was just, you know, where is this getting me? Montana State University at the time was somewhat of a pipeline for Boeing. And I didn't want to be in an engineering pool, designing the next flap on the, whatever the next Dreamliner was going to be.
Right.
So, it was, a crisis of conscience, if you will. Went back to the apartment one day and it was just like, what does my life mean to me? What do I want it to be? And it was more of, I want something rewarding. I want something that felt like it was bigger than just a job. And I didn't really know much about the FBI, but it landed number two on the list of what does Zach want to be when he grows up. Um,
So
yeah,
you
it
literally
prompted
like
me
sat down and made a list, eh?
literally like pen to
Yeah.
paper. And I still do that today. Like I have to run off of a to-do list, a checklist, to keep my thoughts organized. So yeah, I literally sat down with a notepad and it was like, a little check mark in front and what is it next to it? And it was, race car driver, I think FBI agent, I think CIA operative was next after that. And then I'm
Okay.
pretty sure I had DEA and Secret Service trickling on down the line. Again, what did this kid from Montana know about any of that? Next to nothing, other
Okay.
than it looked exciting.
Right. Yeah,
That's it.
absolutely. Movies, TV, books. Yeah, I mean, you think about all that stuff, it's like Al Capone, all that kind of stuff. The FBI fighting mobsters and yeah, all that sounds really cool. And I remember when I was in college, my degree was in sociology, my minor was criminal justice. I went to a career fair and the FBI had a booth and I'm like, I know you have to have a 4-year degree. So I went up there and I said, "Hey, I'm interested." And they're like, "What's your major?" I said, "Well, sociology, minor in criminal justice. We don't want you." And I'm like, "What?" I said, "We want attorneys. We want people going through law school and accountants. That's what
Sure.
we want right now. So we're not looking for cops. We're looking for attorneys and accountants." And I'm like, I was so deflated. I'm just like, really? Okay. But that was just my ignorance. I didn't know any better. So
And I mean, certainly you've got those changes over time. I mean, the wanting to hire attorneys and accountants is fairly steady and consistent. But when I came through, and when I called in early 2001, so just before 9/11, you know, and it was well, you need a bachelor's degree and 3 years work experience. She didn't, fortunately, didn't really ask what my bachelor's degree was. I asked what work experience was, and she's like, well, it's not flipping burgers. So I asked about the military,
yeah.
right? Because at that point, I was like, well, I got to figure out how I'm going to stick out this college thing because it kind of sucks at the moment, and I need to put myself on a path. So, I asked the military question. She's like, yeah, we hire folks from the military. So it was ended that call and went and interviewed with Army and Air Force ROTC. And that put me on a path to what ultimately led me to the Bureau. Um, but certainly the attorneys and lawyers goes all the way back to the Hoover days of what he was trying to recruit. But you also there's some of those internal wars in the Bureau go back 100 years too of some of those guys that were attorneys and accountants in the Bureau that were willing to have those conversations with Hoover about we're chasing gangsters out here. We're not gangsters, right? We're lawyers. We're
Right.
accountants. You might want to consider hiring some folks that you know have spent a lifetime or part of their lifetime behind a gun, not
Right.
just behind an abacus
Yeah.
or a law book,
Yeah, calculator or yeah, abacus
right?
or whatever. Yeah, that's funny. I had Lou Ferrante, he's a mafia historian on my show a couple of weeks ago. And he was talking about J. Edgar Hoover and all the controversy between the Kennedy assassinations and the FBI and all that. And opened my eyes to some stuff. And it was funny because in the 60s, it was all male. It had to be men, and Hoover wanted men that were over 6 foot or over and had a full head of hair. That was like his big thing. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm 5'9" and I'm pretty bald, so that never would have happened for me.
He had his look he wanted to go for his G-men, that's for sure.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting times for sure. But you mentioned the military. You went into the Air Force. Did you go active duty, or was that you did ROTC and then was it reserves after that, or what'd that look like?
I went straight into active duty.
Okay.
So I chose the Air Force program over the Army program again pre 9/11. Was in that program when 9/11 happened,
Wow.
and stuck it out. Finished my degree, graduated from Montana State, and commissioned the same day. And went. I entered active duty. I think like 10 days later. I had active duty orders. I went to Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas. I'd been selected as an intelligence officer, and I went straight on active orders, went straight to school, spent when it was 7 or 8 months at the intelligence school, and then was assigned to my first duty station after that. But yeah, I never did any reserve time other than after I separated from active duty. I had my obligatory 4 years of IAR status, inactive ready reserve status.
Oh,
That
okay.
other than a muster call, I didn't do anything with that.
Okay, so you mentioned that you were an intelligence officer. What exactly is that? You hear that, but it I think there's some misunderstanding or not enough information. Is like it sounds really cool. It sounds, pretty like high speed, but what exactly is it?
Sure, and there is some variance between the services, but on the Air Force side, intelligence or military intelligence has multiple connotations with it. But an intelligence officer is going to be a generalist that's going to be able to float or be assigned across the spectrum of intelligence for the Air Force. So, what does that mean?
Yes.
So, what I specialized in for my first assignment was what's called operational intelligence, which really just you're a glorified and briefer. Like you take finished intelligence, or to some degree at times raw intelligence, and then you brief it to the operator, which in the Air Force 99% of the time is pilots,
Okay.
and the command staff above pilots. So when I went to Fairchild Air Force Base, those operators were flying KC-135s, Air Mobility Command. And when I would deploy with them, it was all of Air Mobility Command. So it was KC-135 tankers to C-17s, C-130s, C-5s. And you did the same thing if you were assigned to Air Combat Command and you went to a fighter squadron or a fighter wing. You're an intelligence officer and you're over intelligence enlisted personnel and non-commissioned officers, and their responsibilities are giving threat briefings to those air crew before they step to their jets. So if you're in a war zone like we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, I would be briefing air crew on what were the threat trends for them, where are the areas that threats were emanating from. Obviously, in Afghanistan and Iraq, after we had crushed their initial air defenses,
Right.
it was manpad threats. So for a KC-135, there's really not a significant manpad threat because man portable air defense missiles can only reach so high.
So
The
that'd be
tankers
somebody with
typically
a
fly
Stinger
high.
missile on the ground that would be shooting up.
You got it, right? So a Stinger
Yeah.
would be an American made, or you've got the different Russian made ones that were typically prolific through the region, and they all had different envelopes. And your job as an intelligence person is to know those envelopes, know where they've been reported, know where they've last been reported as being fired, et cetera. And then I would also refresh them on their CSAR, their combat search and rescue protocols,
Hmm.
what their radio was, how it worked, et cetera. And again, that was the same briefing that a C-130 crew would get or a C-17 crew would get. The C-130s, C-17s obviously had a bigger threat envelope because they're typically going in and landing. Where the
Sure.
KC-135, unless it had a mechanical issue, is never going to land in Afghanistan or Iraq because it's not where they were based.
Okay.
And again, same thing if you were supporting F-16s or F-15s. Other aspects of an intelligence officer in the Air Force would be, we had collection platforms that would fall underneath the, intelligence envelope. So obviously the Air Force has got lots of signal intelligence platforms, flying around, sucking up radio waves and so forth. That's an intelligence stream. Obviously, the intelligence personnel weren't responsible for the hardware, but they were responsible for the information coming off of the hardware and how that would be ingested. And then on the command structure, you'd have, these air operation centers or coalition air operation centers. CAOC is an acronym pretty familiar out there. But you got intelligence personnel in there. And again, so that's like a fusion point where you've got operational activities going on. You've got intelligence collection going on. That's coming into an operations center where those two things are being melded together. And
Mm.
it's ingesting of information, analyzing that information, and then briefing it. So on the, for intelligence in the military, it's really management of ingest of the raw intelligence,
Yeah.
analysis of that information across the different spectrums, and then briefing that information to somebody,
So you
command
just
staff or
okay.
operators.
Yeah, you disperse it to the people that need to hear it.
You got it.
And you're getting this intelligence from boots on the ground, I imagine.
So again, it's for the Air
It all
Force, it's
depends.
less boots on the ground. Other than obviously, you can ingest that information from other services
Yeah.
or other government entities that might be boots on the ground.
Right.
Most Air Force collection platforms were either going to be airframe based, and again, I say most airframe based or satellite based,
Oh, okay.
um,
Gotcha.
right? Because it's cameras looking down, microphones listening down, and different
Mm,
antennas absorbing electrical, radiation waves coming up, right? Because it's coming from radar waves, it's coming from different radios and so forth. You think a conventional sense, like if we ever go to war with a nation state actor again, say we went to war with Iran, well, they've got all those surface to air missile radars, early warning radars. Well, the Air Force is going to have a series of platforms that are absorbing all that radiation.
okay.
And an intelligence personnel is going to be able to figure out what it is. What type of radar was it? Which direction is it going? How
Mm,
strong is it? And what does it mean for when can it start to see our aircraft?
gotcha. Oh,
Yeah.
so how many years did you do that?
4 and change. So like I commissioned in May of 2004, and then I ultimately separated in end of August 2008, and then spent had 2 weeks off and showed up at the academy
All
for the
right.
FBI.
Okay. So you applied for the FBI while you were still active military.
Yeah, totally. I wasn't going to leave a paying job unless I had another one kind of secured. So
Were
I
you
didn't
married at the
submit.
time?
I got married while I was in the service to my practice wife. She was
We all
also
have one of those. Yeah.
she was also in the service. She was in the Air Force with me. We were assigned together. So yes, and so you got to have 3 years of work experience at a minimum to be able to get into the bureau. Well,
Okay.
when I was approaching that threshold, I applied, and then it took a year and a half to get through the hiring process with the bureau, right? Because you phase one's an application review, and then you'd have to take almost like an SAT exam. And you pass that, then you'd get scheduled for an interview, which they called phase two. And then you pass that, and then it's you got to go through a background examination. They're going to redo your security clearance, which I already had a top secret SCI security clearance, but
Yeah.
the FBI being the FBI, they had to do it all over again.
Sure.
And then pass the physical fitness test, and you pass all that, and they decide to give you a class selection date. They'll give you a contingent letter of appointment. And once I received it, then I notified the Air Force that I was going to separate.
Very cool. So
Mm-hmm.
you're in the military, and then you get chosen to get into the next class or an upcoming class for the FBI. Uh, What did that look like? You transitioned from the military. Did you have any time in between before you went to the academy?
They had a 2 week gap. So I
Okay.
separated literally, I think, the last day of August from the Air Force. And then my class report date was September 14th. So, we had a 2 week
That
time frame to get
man,
my stuff across the country and show up.
that's not much time at all. And now is that a dormitory kind of basic training kind of thing for the academy for the FBI?
Yeah, it's definitely, yes, you are in a dormitory setting. It is a professional environment. It's not like a boot camp environment. DEA is a bit more boot camp ish than
Okay.
the FBI is. They're running around in like, all black, 511s and so forth, where
Sure.
we're in, blue polos and khaki pants,
Mm,
khaki 511s at the time. So, yeah, I mean, you show up, the FBI Academy's got these 3 different dorm buildings, and your class is assigned a floor, and you've got a roommate, and you've got 2 other suite mates, right? Because you share a bathroom between you, and it's a lot like a college environment, except for like everything you do is for your job, right? You feel like you put all this pressure on yourself because you feel like you're under a microscope all the time.
sure.
Every test you take could get you, if you fail it, could get you sent home.
Right. Yeah.
If you get told if you do anything stupid, you're going to get sent home. Um, but for the most part, it's a bunch of folks on their second profession, right? The average class age is roughly 30 years old, guys
Okay.
and gals. And, but you eat in the cafeteria together, you go to class together, and I don't know, we had a really good class. So we also would party together on the weekends.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm guessing that's a Monday through Friday, like 8 to 4, weekends off.
Typically, yeah,
Yeah.
occasionally they would have a weekend thing that they would do. But for the most part, yeah, weekends were your time. Initially you're kind of on a probationary period at the academy, and the policy for us was you couldn't during the week and the initial weekends you couldn't go anywhere overnight. You'd
Okay.
later on in the academy, because the academy for us was 21 weeks. later on in the academy, you could leave and go overnight over the weekend, but they wanted accountability with where you were. They
Right,
wanted to
but
know what you're
people
up to.
still, were married. If the average age is 30, a lot of people are going to be married. There's going to be a chunk of people that have children,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. So you have to kind of take that into consideration as well.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, the bureau treats everyone the same, at that academy level. But yeah, you had folks that lived in the area, or maybe they worked in Northern Virginia or something like that.
Ah, okay.
So, once you got past maybe that initial month, you still had to sign out with a book up front on where you were going, but you could be
Okay.
gone for the weekend. Folks could travel home, whether that was up the street or across the country.
Right. So what was your first job in the FBI? Where did you go and what were you assigned to?
I was assigned to Richmond, Virginia, which was right just down the road from Quantico.
Yeah.
Initially was assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which notionally made sense. I mean, I'd been an intelligence guy. I knew quite a bit about, the radical Islamic fight. This is post 9/11 Bureau. So at the time, right after 9/11, the Bureau took many of its criminal assets and put them on the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. So I kind of got there and, landed with a bunch of criminal agents that knew how to work criminal cases, but, didn't really know that much about, Islamic terrorism.
Okay.
So it was kind of a, where they were looking at me with, will tell us how to do a terrorism investigation. And I'm looking at them saying, like, I can tell you what terrorism is, but tell me what an investigation looks like. Right. So
Yeah.
it was, back then all the political pressure was on international terrorism. And it was like, you have to find it. You have to find it. You have to flip over every stone.
Right.
Um, so it was a, looking for typically Sunni radicalized Islamists, material support to terrorism. So at the time in the late 2000s, you had Yemen was a hot spot, and you had concepts of funding from the United States going to Sunni-based radicalized Islamists over in Yemen, and you're looking for money going back and forth. I mean, the reality of it was there just weren't that many terrorists in the United States or folks supporting terrorism in the United States, but you had a massive apparatus looking for them.
Right. And
So I spent,
understandably,
yeah,
I get that. And I remember being a cop, I started in 95 and I retired in 20. So, I went through all the 9/11 stuff and I remember more, we had, like in services, et cetera. It's like, oh, be on the lookout for this or that or, et cetera. And you'd stop somebody, you'd run them. And it's like, oh, shit, the FBI wants to talk to this person. They're on a terrorist task force list, whatever, blah, blah, blah.
sure.
This is me in a squad car. And it's like, wow, I just caught a really big fish. Then you call your boss, they'd call a phone number that was on the teletype. It's like, no, we don't want anything to do with him anymore. He's been ruled out or whatever. I'm like, ah, bump, bump, bump. Like, here, I
Sure.
thought I had the next Osama bin Laden in my car. Like, I guess
Right.
not. Here's your speeding ticket. Bye. And so there was a lot of that going on. A lot of my buddies and I, you'd stop somebody. It was like, oh, they're on this list. Oh, outstanding. This is great. And oh, I guess they just aren't interested in this person anymore. I was like, all right, well, so be it. So you're there. How many years were you in Richmond?
See, I was in Richmond from beginning of 2009 until 2017, mid 2017.
Oh, okay.
So,
Fair amount of
you
time.
know, yeah, 8 plus years. Um, it was a great time. I only spent a couple years in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and I was fortunate enough to be moved down to the criminal squad, which at the time, and I was in headquarters city versus one of our satellite resident agencies. Like, we had satellite offices scattered around the
Sure.
state: Charlottesville, Roanoke, Fredericksburg, Bristol, etc. Um, when I moved to the criminal squad, there were really two. There was there's gangs, violent crime, Talk West, which would be drugs, and then you had the other squad was public corruption, white collar crime, and I don't know. I loved it down there. I quickly became linked up with DEA. Murph and I talked about this, that I started splitting I was asked to join the DEA task force group, and I started splitting my time with between the bureau and with DEA. And it just, all of my gang cases effectively had a drug nexus. I did
Sure.
have a couple of, straight up drug cases, which the Bureau would call a TOC West, Transnational Organized Crime West,
Mm.
Western Hemisphere case. Um, but it was fun. That's everything that at least I thought of the FBI when I was on the outside looking in, which was, you know, running and gunning and, figuring out how to put people in prison and, doing, you know, informant drug buys, undercover drug buys, running a lot of surveillance. I was on the SWAT team, and every month we'd have SWAT training and we'd have SWAT operations and traveling with the SWAT team and going to Puerto Rico and, you know, Arkansas, going do security at the inaugurations. And it was a really fun time.
So
You get a little bit of a look at some of the dirty underbelly of the Bureau at times, but when you're just in the trenches, at least it used to be, when you were just in the trenches doing the work, if you were being left alone, life was pretty good.
yeah, I'll back up just a little bit. You were a SWAT operator. I know there's the HURT team, the hostage rescue team with the FBI.
HRT, yeah.
Yeah, you got the HURT team, and then you have SWAT. What's the difference between the two? And now, were you full-time SWAT, or was this just like a call-up kind of thing, and then you trained X amount of hours, per month or per period, or what did that look like?
Yeah. So the Bureau's tactical program is all notionally managed underneath the Critical Incident Response Group in its tactical section. The Hostage Rescue Team, or HRT, based out of Quantico, is the only full-time tactical asset of the FBI.
Okay.
Everything else is a part-time gig, if you will. So HRT is all FBI special agents. Most of them came from SWAT teams. They went through the 2-week HRT selection process, were picked up, and then they went through the 8 to 12 months, depending on what generation you were, new operator training school or not. And all they do is train and do operations. They don't do casework anymore. They don't run informants.
Okay.
They're the only ones. There's 3 teams, gold, blue, and silver, and then each team is broken up into assaulter groups and sniper groups. Each field division, and there's 56 field divisions across the country, each field division has its own SWAT team. Those SWAT teams are being on SWAT as an auxiliary duty. There are a couple of folks maybe per field office that are full-time. Maybe the team leader is full-time, or maybe they've got a training coordinator that's full-time. But for the most part, everybody else is expected to be a case agent.
Okay.
And then you're expected to train, depending on, again, what year we're talking. When I first joined the program, you're supposed to train 3 days a month, and then it grew to 4 days a month. And they've got a list of tasks that you're supposed to be proficient at. You got to do firearms every week, or excuse me, every month. There's schools and stuff you got to go through. I mean, I went through the sniper course and the breacher course, not, effectively the rappelling course. I became a team leader. It's a lot of fun. And, but you're going to, at the field office level, you're going to pick up all of the high risk arrests and high risk search warrant executions, right? That's the whole point of
Sure.
the SWAT team. The Bureau is more forward leaning than a local police department SWAT team. Like, we don't react to a lot. I mean, obviously the hostage rescue team is formed, with the idea they would react to a hostage rescue situation, but
Right.
that doesn't happen that often in the United States. Or if it does happen, it's resolved very quickly, well before the hostage rescue team
Yes.
gets there. SWAT teams for the Bureau, 99% of the time, are there to execute pre-planned arrests and search warrants that are considered high or higher risk
Okay.
than
Okay.
what a squad would execute on its own.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how much or how little did you work with the locals on that? Or did you?
So, I mean, I worked with the locals a lot via the nature of the work I did, right? You're not going to work a gang and drug case without integrating with the locals.
Right.
And, a lot of times they would have a concurrent investigation to what we would have. And sometimes, if it was a state paper investigation, then maybe the local, Richmond City or Henrico County or Chesterfield County SWAT team would execute it. If we had a big takedown on a gang case, sometimes it's like, referred to as throw them a bone, right? We would, if we were bringing in multiple SWAT teams to be able to say we were going to arrest 10 people one morning. Well, the FBI has the capability of bringing in 10 SWAT teams, right? To be able, right? Because we could just pull from all the other field offices, and HRT would probably get one as well. But if you've been working a gang case alongside one of those local police departments, they're a bunch of hard chargers. They want
Yep.
work for their SWAT team. We would give
Absolutely.
them a target, right? So it'd be Fed paper. for a search and arrest warrant or some combination therein, and we might give one of those operations to the Henrico County SWAT team or the Chesterfield County SWAT team or whatever in the region for where that takedown was. In addition to, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever the number needed to be of FBI, SWAT, and HRT teams to be able to execute those presumably high risk warrants.
Okay. That makes sense to me. And these, being in that SWAT team, it sounds like your career is going good. Those are definitely, they don't pick dead wood to do that kind of work. So, that's a feather in your cap, for being able to do that. You were on these task forces. I've worked and I've been around some agents that you could tell had very limited street experience by the way they
Sure.
conducted themselves. And I've physically have had to move, not just FBI, but other federal agents like out of the harm's way because they were just oblivious to what the street actually was.
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't grow up in the street, which let's be honest, most folks that become federal agents didn't didn't have to overcome, you know, living in the projects. It
Right.
happens, but again, you you got to be performing well in life to be able to get to become a federal agent in the vast majority of cases. Now, there certainly are some exceptional examples of folks that overcame significant hardships in early childhood to be able to go on to university and get a good bachelor's degree with
Right.
good grades and then get a good job afterwards, et cetera. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that a lot of folks that become federal agents are not from the street, which means they're not street wise. And if they
Correct.
get put on a joint terrorism task force or they start working bank, wire fraud, on a white collar, or
Right. If
you know,
they're financial
they're
crimes, like they're
they're
not
not gonna they're never gonna learn it. And I
right.
mean, I grew up in the country, so like I certainly was not streetwise when I first started. I was fortunate enough that I could talk to people, but it just took repetition and just spending days of sitting in a car in surveillance in the in low income neighborhoods. And a lot of the gang cases I worked were what most of the gang members were black, which meant most of the neighborhoods they were coming from were black. I'm obviously not black, but it's how do you go into that neighborhood and sit surveillance and not just stick out or feel like you're always sticking out. And that nothing overcomes that except for just time and experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And how you deal with people, either they're going to be a potential informant for you or just arresting somebody. It's like, hey, you know what? I'm married to this guy for the next like 8 hours or whatever. Is this going to be a miserable experience or is this going to be an okay experience? The end result is I'm going to go home at the end of my shift and you're going to jail when I leave. But it's like that's the one thing that drives me crazy in TV and movies. The asshole cop that's getting in the guy's face, and if why rile them up? Why are you doing this? I mean,
Sure.
we've all worked with that officer, whoever that could, make Gandhi a fighter, that could make Mother Teresa a no person. There are those out there, but yeah. But it was interesting to me. I think ATF had some pretty high speed agents that were pretty street smart. They had a lot of experience, boots on the ground, like interacting with people. Marshals for sure. Their fugitive task forces, and that's the cool thing about working on task forces. It's a blend of different agencies, and everybody learns from each other, or at least they should learn from each other, and that's the street stuff too. So, in a perfect world, that's the way it works. But
Yeah, for sure.
so things are going good. You're a SWAT operator. You're a firearms instructor. Working on these task forces. So from Richmond, where did you go?
So from Richmond, I went back, was asked to come back to the academy and teach. I mean, I applied for the job and I ended up being selected for, at the time, was referred to as the tactical training unit at the FBI Academy, which has bounced back and forth in names. When I went through the academy as a student, it was the practical applications unit. I believe now it is back to being called the practical applications unit. But for those that have ever watched any TV shows or anything on the FBI Academy, I worked in Hogan's Alley, right? So
Oh, cool.
Hogan's Alley is our make believe city or our town.
Right.
The town of Hogan's Alley. We've got single family homes, town homes, trailers, apartments, bank, you know, pharmacy, et cetera, right? And we've got paid role players so that we can take students that are getting classroom instruction on legal interviewing, We can introduce them to, basic law enforcement tactics, how to approach a house, how to clear a room, left, right, center, etc. They're getting firearms instruction from the firearms training unit. They're getting defensive tactics instruction from the defensive tactics unit, how to fight, how to handcuff, etc. We bring them into this environment, and it brings all of that together, hence practical application. So it's like, how do you practically apply
Yeah.
all of your classroom instruction? And I did that for 2 years. I loved it. It could times can be a little bit of a groundhog day because you got class after class after
Yeah.
class
Sure.
coming
Sure.
through. But I had a great mesh of personalities on my instructional team, guys and girls. A lot of us had a SWAT team background and or a significant criminal investigative background. In other words, like folks that knew the street, knew how to interact with folks.
Yeah.
So that, when they're sitting outside of our house that's full of role players and you're talking and you're coaching a new agent trainee on what they need to do, you're doing so from a point of expertise and a point of experience. And it was a lot of fun. It was really rewarding.
Okay. So you did that for 2 years, then where did you go?
So, excuse me, having been from Montana, grown up from Montana, at this point I was married to my real wife, and we were starting our family.
Hmm.
And I wanted to move back out west. I wanted to raise my kids in the mountains, and so it was just kind of a question of how do you get there.
Right.
The FBI Academy is not necessarily a good stepping stone in the bureau either. So you don't want to go there and stay too long because you can become pretty irrelevant to the field pretty fast.
Sure.
So I applied. I'd heard that the Coeur d'Alene RA supervisory senior resident agent position, which is just a fancy term for you're the FBI supervisor over a given geographical region for a satellite office. So the Coeur d'Alene office was a satellite office. The bureau calls them resident agencies or RAs.
Like
That position was coming open.
how many agents would be in satellite like that?
Yeah, so it really depends. For Coeur d'Alene, it's you had 4 to 6 agents in Coeur d'Alene, and you had 2 to 3 agents in Lewiston, which also fell underneath the Coeur d'Alene supervisor. So it was the northern 10 counties of Idaho. That's fairly typical for these satellite offices where you've got less than 10 FBI agents. Somewhere between 2 to 6 is pretty common. But then you got places like some of the border RAs, out of the San Antonio division, they might have 60 agents in them. Or you've got
Oh, okay.
the Northern Virginia RA out of the Washington field. I mean, it probably has a couple of hundred. So it can depend. Some RAs are big enough that they'll have multiple squads. For me in Northern Idaho, it was just one squad. We worked everything under the sun except for counterintelligence. But I competed for the position and ultimately was selected for it. And then my wife and one child at the time and my dad, who I was taking care of, moved from Virginia to Coeur d'Alene in the spring of 2019.
Oh, okay. So was that a promotion? Or I'm not real familiar with the FBI, like rank structure.
Yeah. So when you get hired on as an FBI agent, you're a GS-10,
Okay.
and then you progress on a time scale from GS-10 to 11 to 12 to 13. So you're a GS-13 by the time you're approximately 5 years on the street as a special agent. And unless you promote to a supervisory role, you'll always be a GS-13. You'll just change in band. So GS step 1 to 10.
Okay.
But a supervisory agent, which at the academy, I was technically a supervisory agent. It's a GS-14 position. DEA guys remain 13s when they go back to the academy. But the bureau being the bureau, those positions are GS-14s. So when I took the notional promotion to go back as a field supervisor, I just was another GS-14 position. Where at the academy, I really wasn't supervising anybody directly. Now you're back in the field
Okay.
and you're supervising personnel.
So when you went to Idaho, you were the boss.
Yes, for my little region.
Okay, so
Yep.
you're the boss. Now you're there, and how does everything go at first?
I mean, everything went generally well. I had I'd been warned of a couple of problems before I got here. I'd been told that I needed to take a hard look at the FBI had a violent crime task force out of Coeur d'Alene that, I needed to look at, that they weren't doing much federal work, and that there was just a long-standing, difficult relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office, notably the Coeur d'Alene branch of the Idaho U.S. Attorney's Office. But for the most part, I showed up. I met my folks, and then I quickly hit the road to start, putting a face to a name with all my state and local counterparts between Virginia State Police, county sheriffs, city police departments. I was from this region, and I sold that card pretty hard that, I
Sure.
wasn't coming from California. I wasn't specifically coming from the East Coast, that I was a Montana kid kind of coming home. And that was generally accepted pretty well. Now, Idaho is not overly fed friendly, right? I mean, just up the road from me, you had Ruby Ridge, with the Weaver family. So that's
Right.
right. Idaho is a very red, very conservative state. So there is certainly an interesting dynamic between being a federal agent and working with locals. You know, and I just tried to, present myself as, you know, I'm not looking to just punch my card and move on. I want to live here. It's part of the country I want to be. I understand that I'm a Fed, but my job is to enforce federal law. These are the priorities that I'm looking at, violent crime, drug crime, significant white collar crime. And I wanted to show that, look, I want to be value added to the community from a law enforcement perspective. And that if they ever needed assistance with something, that I could start bringing a lot of assistance to bear when it was necessary. And again, I think that's hard to say no to. It's hard to hate a guy that comes up, and approaches you
Yeah,
like that and is willing to just
absolutely.
talk over coffee. So for the most part, I was able to have pretty good relationships. There were a couple that were pretty tough, but that's also just kind of the nature of the beast when you're dealing with so many personalities.
Absolutely. Now, you said you were forewarned about the U.S. Attorney's Office. In what aspect?
Yeah, I mean, the Idaho U.S. Attorney's Office is known for not being particularly, prosecution friendly. Most U.S. Attorney's Office across the country, tout their 96, 98% conviction rate. Well, there's two ways you get that conviction rate. One is
I'm
by
laughing. I'm laughing because I know where this is going.
you don't take a case that you aren't completely assured that you're going to win. And, they also leverage people really hard to take plea deals. So the Idaho U.S. Attorney's Office, if everything's on a spectrum, they were on one end of that spectrum of not being particularly aggressive when it come to prosecutions. And the Coeur d'Alene branch office out of, if Idaho's one district for the federal side, you've got the main offices in Boise, which is the state capital, and you've got a branch office in Coeur d'Alene, you've got a branch office in Pocatello. And the branch offices were known for being even less aggressive than the U.S. Attorney's Office as a whole. And then you had a managing AUSA up here, which is kind of notionally a supervisor. They call it the branch manager, which is a difficult personality to work with and was even less aggressive. And that person also kind of functioned as an intake for the office. So it was just, again, just generational historical frustration between the FBI as a law enforcement investigative entity and trying to get cases prosecuted through the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Yeah.
Just games of a lot of cases not going, but then the U.S. Attorney's Office not wanting to give a declination letter, trying to avoid the topic of, we'll think about it, and that we'll think about it lasts for a year or several years or forever, and so I just, all of my predecessors that I had talked to had that difficult relationship. All of them had raised it with management in Salt Lake City, which was my chain of command. And my predecessor directly before me had even broached it with the U.S. Attorney, Bart Davis, at the time, that we have a real problem with the senior U.S. Assistant U.S. Attorney in Coeur d'Alene, but ultimately they just never did anything about it. And again, I took my own tact with it. I got some guidance from my peers on how I could handle it, and it's just, again, what do you do? You try to make your agents work the best cases that they can. You try to have the best relationships you can. You try to have a good relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And my point was, I want everything to just be black and white, and I want decisions to be made. Don't just try to hide in the shadows. If you want to
Yeah.
prosecute the case, great, let's move forward. If you're not going to prosecute the case, then I just want to know that up front so my agents don't waste a bunch of time, and we'll work with the locals or the tribe to get it prosecuted.
Yeah, for those who don't know, you as a FBI agent, you're working a case, you arrest somebody and you present it to the US attorney just like a city cop would arrest somebody and present it to the district attorney. That's circuit court, this is federal court. And from what
Yes.
you're saying, and I've run into this 100 times, we had some really good, hardworking DAs that weren't afraid to take something on that wasn't a slam dunk. Then you had to have other ones that if they weren't like 99.9% sure they were going to get a conviction, they just they didn't want anything to do with it. They wanted the
Sure.
easy.
Mhm.
And a lot of it was laziness. I'll just call it what it was. It's
Yeah.
like, well, I don't have to
Call a
work
spade
real
a
hard.
spade.
Yeah, I don't have to work too hard on this if I know this is, a slam dunk. So take that for whatever it is. And then you said there was a violent crime task force in the area. What was the situation with that?
Yeah, so the Bureau I mean, at that point, it was a decade old ish violent crime task force that had participation from the county sheriff's office, one of the smaller police departments, one representative from Virginia, or excuse me, Idaho State Police. And I think we had HSI agent on there. And then I had one FBI agent that was the coordinator for the task force who was assigned.
Yeah.
The Coeur d'Alene Police Department had recently, before I got there, had pulled all of their, I think, like 4 officers off of the task force and had partnered with the U.S. Marshal Service to do what they wanted to do with U.S. Marshals.
Hmm.
And again, I'd come in, I'd worked on a FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. I'd worked on an FBI Safe Streets Game Task Force. I'd been on a DEA task force group. I'd been a part of the Virginia State Police Counter Drug Task Force. So
Yeah.
I love task forces, had a great flavor for task forces, and was used to, a lot of work coming out of a task force and, putting some really good cases together, both at the state level and at the Fed level. And I'd just been kind of warned that, hey, Zach, that might not be happening, but you're a good person to kind of lay eyes on that. And, it was a difficult go. In some respects, there were some really good guys on the task force. But, I started trying to push on the FBI agent that worked for me on the task force, say, hey, you need to teach these guys how to do some federal work. Like
Right.
we're doing stuff we're not supposed to do. Like none of their cases that they're working are going anywhere on the state side. Their
Mm.
cases aren't going into the FBI file system. You're statting stuff that we really shouldn't stat. Their informants aren't being, you're running informants out of a filing cabinet. We're not supposed to do that. So I tried to walk that line of not being the new guy that just came crashing down of like,
Right.
this is all wrong. Everything has to change.
Yeah, sure.
I started, I rolled out with the task force and I just tried to be, a guy that would fill in wherever that, just be a guy out there, right? Just another badge and a gun. You tell me, like, I'm not the team leader. Whoever's warrant it was the team leader. And I tried not to step into that leadership role unless I had to. But I also got to watch how the task force operated and then started to try to push for some incremental change to kind of tighten up the ship,
Okay.
abide by FBI policy where we needed to abide by it. Let's start working some federal cases. And I just kind of ran into some brick walls.
Understood. So what kind of cases were you handling there? Like what was like some of the normal day-to-day cases that you were handling there?
Yeah. So, I mean, out here in the RA, we're Indian country heavy. So, for your listeners, if a Indian tribe signed a treaty with the U.S. government, we're talking back in the 1800s, then they are considered a federally recognized tribe. And many of those tribes, through those treaties, were given reservations. So in North Idaho, in my territory, you had 3. You had the Nez Perce Reservation, you had the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, and you had the Kootenai Reservation, all of which corresponded with those tribes, the Nez Perce tribe, the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and the Kootenai tribe. Well, those are, because of those treaties, those are considered federal territories. And what that means, and it's changed a little bit with some recent Supreme Court precedent, is that the members of those tribes that live on those reservations, they are beholden to tribal law and they're beholden to federal law. The state law does not apply to them. And
Okay.
now I'm simplifying that to some degree because in Idaho you had, that doesn't necessarily apply on the highways where, Idaho State Police has authority over the highway and can ticket
That
anybody.
sounds like a
All
mess
that,
to tell you the
I mean,
truth.
it
Oh
is
my gosh.
it's a jurisdictional nightmare. But
Yeah.
that was a lot of our work was just crime that would normally fall to county and city investigators and your county prosecutors here in Idaho would have to fall to the feds because if it was a assault with a deadly weapon or a sexual assault of a child, it would go to the tribe or would go to us. And the tribe only has misdemeanor authority, right? So they don't have the ability to send anybody to prison. They can only
Oh,
put somebody in jail, right? So it's effectively a misdemeanor. They could convict somebody of murder, but it's going to jail for 12 months or less. So it's a
no kidding.
misdemeanor crime.
Okay. Now,
Yep.
how did you get along with, like, say, the tribal police? What was your relationship with them?
Really good for the most part.
Okay,
It was different between the three. The Kootenai tribe was really small, and I had limited interaction with them. You're only talking about a couple of hundred residents. The Coeur d'Alene tribe, when I first got here, there was a special agent that had worked for 24 years out of this office, and he worked the Coeur d'Alene tribe that whole time. And obviously, his relationship was solid. So
sure.
meet and greets here and there, but I let that agent do what he needed to do. And if he wanted me there, I was there. If he didn't need me there, I wasn't there. And then my Lewiston office, where the Nez Perce tribe was, had a lot more agent turnover. I had a lot younger agents down there. I was down there a lot. Was very integrated with the court or with the Nez Perce police department and some of their tribal services. I mean, I had a great relationship with them
Okay.
in general, and we did a lot of work on that reservation.
All
It's
right.
a big reservation, a lot of tribal members.
So you're getting your feet wet, you're acclimated, all this is going on. What was your view of FBI leadership at this point in your career?
Loaded question there, bud. My view of FBI leadership. So going all the way back to when I was, when you first get to the academy, the culture is there is no better job in the bureau than being a street agent. So you're kind of indoctrinated into this culture of FBI leadership isn't great, and really more referred to as FBI management isn't great,
Hmm.
and this concept of some of the culture to the bureau, which is you never embarrass the bureau. If the bureau wants to find a way to screw you, it'll do it. The best job is be at the bottom. Um, when I got to Richmond, I got a mixed flavor. I saw some good supervisors. I saw some not good supervisors. The management, I felt pretty, even though Richmond was not a large office and I was, but, 30 feet, my first cubicle was probably 30 feet away from the special agent in charge's, suite. There's a fair amount of distance, conceivably between myself and that SAC, special agent in charge. And it was just, there were some pretty poor management officials at the SAC and the ASAC level, and a couple of good ones. I had kind of withstood some of the pressures, political pressures at the time, which was to find international terrorism and just, you got to find this, you got to find this. We need the numbers. We need the numbers. But it was all a bit abstract. There was, change out of special agents in charge and assistant special agents in charge every, 18 months or so. But it really wasn't until I got to the FBI Academy and I was at a headquarters unit that I saw really how thin the benches were for FBI executive management. Executive management would be like GS 15, and
Okay.
then the SES ranks, senior executive service. And some of it was horrible. I had a pretty poor interaction with a section chief at the academy. My whole unit did, and I'd confronted the section chief on something that I thought was wrong, and I had some interactions with some of my senior mentors that had left the bureau over it. And their advice to me was, Zach, you just got to be quiet. It doesn't affect you directly. You got your job in Coeur d'Alene. Like, don't file a whistleblower complaint. Don't do anything because nothing's anonymous in the bureau.
Right.
Just keep your head down, get out to your RA, and take care of your people and do good work.
Like, what kind of stuff are we talking about? Or can you say?
Yeah, no, I could say they. So we had a changeover in leadership at the section level, and this, you know, my unit, tactical trading unit, was always under a microscope because at the time when folks were being removed from the academy for failure to perform, a lot of that stuff was coming to light during practical applications, right? Because
Sure.
when you're in legal training, you're just either you pass the test or you don't.
Right.
But if you come
Yeah.
to practical applications unit and you can't understand the difference between shooting somebody legally and not, that's a problem.
That's a
And you're
huge
only going to
problem.
see that when you put them in that type of scenario.
Yeah, you
And
never
the
know
job
how
of it,
somebody's going to react under that kind of stress. You never know.
absolutely. And now, granted, there's the teaching aspect of it, but there's also we would have to document that, hey, you just smoked your teammate in the back. That's not a good idea.
Right.
You're going to get counseled on that. It's going to be documented. Well, if you keep making those type of judgment and performance mistakes, that could lead to a performance review board. And for some folks at the time, it was getting them dismissed. All right. So where I'm going with that is that, we were under a bit of a microscope, and we were all tactical instructors, and you had to be a tactical instructor to be in that unit. Well, we had a gentleman apply for an open position within the unit that had no background in tactical anything, had never been on a criminal squad, hadn't been on a SWAT team, hadn't been on a fugitive team, wasn't a tactical instructor, wasn't a firearms instructor, wasn't any of the general prerequisites. Well, my peers that set that career board didn't rank that person. In other words, they weren't even considered. Like their resume was looked at, but they weren't ranked. So if you had one position open and you had 5 people put in, you say, right, well, here's the 1, 2, 3 order of preference that we think should be considered, and these other 2
Yeah.
shouldn't be considered. Well, this individual wasn't considered because he didn't meet the minimums. Well, that individual was friends with the section chief, was neighbors, and he ordered those agents, those my peers, to reconvene it, and that they were ordered to rank that individual, even though he didn't meet it. That was not a good thing. And then, it was, well, you're just going to rank him, but, we understand if that he doesn't meet the minimums for your unit, but we don't want to have to go through the rigmarole of getting him into the academy via a different job. We've got other jobs for him. We'll take him. Well, it didn't work out like that, right? They were forced to rank him, and voila, he was hired and brought to the tactical training unit, but he still wasn't certified to be an instructor. And we had a certification program that you had to pass to be able to become a tactical instructor. Well, you got to have a fairly decent depth of tactical experience to pass that program.
Sure, it makes sense.
Because otherwise, it's just drinking from a fire hose. Well, my peer that was in charge of that program was pulled aside and said, hey, this person's going to pass that instructor cert. And my peer was like, yeah, if he passes the instructor cert, he'll pass the instructor cert. Sure. Well, no, he didn't pass the instructor cert, and my peer wasn't willing to certify him, and they removed my peer, my buddy, from that position and got somebody else in that would do their bidding. All that is wrong, right? Is it against the law? No, it's not against the law. But is it morally wrong? Is it against FBI policy? Yes, yes, and yes, right? So that was an example of wrongdoing that I was starting to see, some of the poor personalities that were up at the executive level, and was kind of putting some of that poor taste in my mouth, even before coming to Coeur d'Alene.
And what I've seen from, like a local perspective and a big police department is the same exact thing, where because this person is X, Y, or Z, they are now anointed, whatever position. And you know what? Okay, you put him in as like the senior accounting guy or whatever. He might miss some number stuff or whatever, but we're talking about serious stuff. We're talking about shooting people. We're talking about safety of the community and, your fellow agents or officers. You can't screw around with that. Like I said before, if it's all right, we'll put him in the academy, he could teach accounting. Even though he doesn't know that much about accounting, he can kind of learn or whatever. Fine. We'll throw him in there. But for something like this, it's inexcusable because, well, first, it's wrong. And you're doing a disservice to the person that, even though they want that job really bad, it's still a disservice to them.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, you can't, if you're trying to prepare new agent trainees for a career in law enforcement, you need to put the best instructor in front of them to give them the best instruction possible on the skills that's going to save their life and the life of everybody that's around them, because they're going to be walking around with a loaded gun on their hip. And bad judgment can cost them their life, can cost them a member of the public's life. And putting someone in front of them to give them instruction that's never really had to clear leather themselves is a real problem, and it's a detriment to the organization.
Yeah. And most people can sniff that out too. You'll get zero respect. I mean, from the people you're either working with, they're not going to give you any respect. And the students, some of them that have life experience, can kind of sense it's like, okay, this guy doesn't know shit. It's like, all right, whatever. So that's another can of worms for another day. But so you see this, it's in the back of your head. Now let's fast forward to the summer of 2022. What happened?
Yeah. So 22, I'd been on the job here in Coeur d'Alene for 3 years, 3.5 years. By the time June, July, and August rolled around, so it's coming off of COVID. It's coming off the Black Lives Matter protests and, Antifa riots and so forth. We had an LGBTQ pride event that was scheduled in the city park in downtown Coeur d'Alene. And there was a local group that was certainly counter to the LGBTQ group. And they were causing a bit of a, social media and conventional media dust up over it. And we as the FBI were kind of monitoring some of the conversations back and forth. Some informant information was coming in. It was just generalized threats of, people, this counter group called the Panhandle Patriots, telling the media, hey, if they want a war, let it be here. Is that a direct threat? No. Is it kind of threatening? It kind of is. It's
Yeah.
going to be escalating. They're asking people to lawfully bring their guns into downtown Coeur d'Alene as kind of a show of strength. On the other side, you've got, the LGBTQ movement, saying, well, our drag queens can bring their guns too. Again, what does that mean? Is that a direct threat of force or violence? It isn't, but it's an escalation of kind of threatening rhetoric.
Right.
So we were sharing that information with the sheriff's office and with Coeur d'Alene Police Department. And ultimately, on the day of, the Coeur d'Alene Police Department had an all hands on deck kind of philosophy and a command post.
Okay.
They asked if I would sit the command post. I did. They were juggling some intelligence that had come in from a West Coast Police Department that there were, I think, 20 or more Antifa members were in town and ready to do battle, if you will. So they were very much on the lookout for that. You had this counter LGBTQ group was there. They had, they had permits to be in a different park nearby, and many of them had their firearms, which is legal in Idaho. And then you had all sorts of folks walking around the park, open carrying firearms. Again, legal in Idaho. But you don't know if they're are they pro LGBTQ? Are they the anti LGBTQ? You certainly had some folks with banners, but it was tense.
Yeah.
I was there, I was watching, I was communicating with my agents, which I didn't have any of them on duty that day, but I had them kind of in a posture of, if something happens, I may call you in. And if you hear of something from an informant, like, channel it to me, and as necessary, I'll disseminate within the command post. I had a assistant U.S. attorney who she had informed me that she was going to be going to the Pride event, was aware that she had a child associated with the Pride community, all good to go. She and I exchanged some messages. I just said, hey, be cautious while you're there. Like, it's clearly pretty tense. You got all these folks walking around with guns. And
Right.
she replied by sending me a text message of a picture of a guy with a gun, and just said, yep, I'm just walking around, just hanging out with people here. And everything was fine until a 911 call came in that there was 20 or more individuals getting in the back of a U-Haul box truck looking like a little army. Now, the command post heard that, and the police chief who was out on the street heard that, and they quickly went looking for a U-Haul truck, found one, pulled it over, and they pulled 31 people out of it.
Okay.
We were watching a Twitter feed of a suspected Antifa member in the command post. That person walked over to where the car stop was, and that's how we were watching it, because Coeur d'Alene doesn't have a bunch of CCTV.
Right.
So we're watching this Twitter feed, and I, at least, and it was kind of unspoken in the command post, was like, is this really going to be Antifa? Like, they actually show up?
Yeah.
But then they start pulling these guys out of the back of this truck, and they're wearing khaki pants and blue shirts and white face coverings and baseball caps. It's like, that's clearly not Antifa. And then we started to put together that it was the Patriot Front, because they had stuff on their shirts, and their colors were like this group, the Patriot Front, which was a group that was a white nationalist type group. And they were, they had come through town before and put up some propaganda stickers and so forth. And they were also known to protest around the country. Anyway, chief of police made the call. I don't know who you are. Everybody's going to jail today. So they all got hooked on a misdemeanor charge, which was conspiracy to riot, which is underneath their disturbing the peace statute, which is effectively conspiring to disturb the peace. So low bar, hooked them all, did search incident to arrest, took all the stuff off of them, put it back in the box truck, took everybody to jail. And then the next day, the city wrote and executed search warrants associated with that box truck and 2 other vehicles that were found near where the box truck had come from. And they seized a bunch of electronic devices. A lot of these guys had GoPro cameras on them,
Okay.
their cell phones, etc.
Yeah.
So, carrying on with the story, I reacted to that. I briefed that up to my management chain up in Salt Lake City, but as this started getting media attention, I spent the entire next day actually sitting right here, working from home and writing updates. So as the PD was doing its thing and I was getting information from FBI headquarters and other FBI field offices, I was writing these updates as to what do we have, what's going on, is there a there, and everybody was really happy. It was, Zach, the FBI is in front of the threat. This is good look for us. Let's run these guys through the databases. Let's see if we've
Now,
got investigations on them, et
did
cetera.
did this make national news or was it local?
And it made national news for a couple of days.
Okay, so they identified these people in the U-Haul. Now, what happened? Did they initially try to charge them up? They arrested them on local charges, correct?
Yeah, so the city arrested them on local charges. The city executed their own local search warrant,
Okay.
to seize these
And
devices.
and what happened with the cases of everyone
Well,
that got
so
arrested?
yeah, so they all stayed with those misdemeanor cases. The city didn't dismiss them. The city prosecutor's office didn't dismiss them. They went on, and this is where the Fed got intertwined with them. But ultimately, to kind of skip to the end on that, the city stuck to those misdemeanor charges. One person took a plea, and then they had a couple of defendants. One was the leader of the group, and another guy had some defense attorneys that were really starting to dig their heels in on this.
Yeah.
And they were asking for more discovery and asking for exculpatory stuff. Well, some of the other guys had some less aggressive defense attorneys. And
Okay.
come about summer of 2023, the city convicted a handful of guys on this misdemeanor charge of, conspiracy to riot. And then, but then they started hitting roadblocks with these other two. It was the Thomas State versus Thomas Rousseau and State versus Richard Jessup. And those defense attorneys were just adamant that you're not giving us everything. And the judges started to find in the defense's favor. And at the end of all that, both of those cases were dismissed with prejudice, kicked out by the judge, and the city was found to be in violation of the Brady ruling, which for those that are out there, you can Google the Brady ruling. But what Brady means in a general sense is that it is incumbent upon the prosecution and it's incumbent upon the government to provide to the defense anything that the state has in its possession that would be valuable for putting forth a defense
Yeah,
of
it's
the subject.
discovery. Yeah.
Discovered, right?
Yep.
Exculpatory information. Every cop knows this. Every
Yeah, it's
prosecutor knows
very
this.
basic. Yeah.
It's super duper basic. Well, the city wasn't doing that. And in large part, they weren't doing that because the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office was no longer willing to play ball with them. The court was ordering that a federal search warrant be handed over that was used to search all of these electronic devices. And I realize we kind of skipped over that. We come back and get it.
Yeah.
The court was ordering that some of these physical devices were returned to the defendant so that they could be searched for supposed exculpatory information. The court was ordering that chains of custody were provided for these devices. And in one of the other cases, an actual digital forensic exam of all these devices to the tune of umpteen terabytes was turned over to the defense. The state didn't highlight that those devices included anything exculpatory. And the state's argument was, well, we weren't going to give you these devices in the first place because we weren't going to use them in our criminal case against you. Which, again, if they're prosecuting a conspiracy to riot case and they're not going to use anything from the phones of these individuals,
Right.
something smells foul. Well, sure enough, the defense started searching these devices and finding exculpatory information on these devices, which, again, Brady violation, not providing information that's presumably going to be beneficial to the defense. So what you ended up having was those two cases were dismissed and the state was found to have committed Brady violations. And then subsequent to that, everybody else got pled out to a failure to purchase a parade permit. So not a criminal charge, a
So
city infraction.
it's
for,
like a seatbelt ticket almost. I mean, it's like
100%.
really? Yeah.
Yep. It was, all right, fine, pay $200 and get out of our face.
Now, now let's back up a little bit. Who was saying that these people were probably or part of the January 6th insurrection?
Yeah, so that's the chapter we skipped over. So,
Yeah.
if the event happened on a Saturday, and I had this assistant U.S. attorney was down there in the event. By Sunday, that AUSA was communicating to me that the U.S. Attorney's Office wanted to find federal charges for these guys because of all the media attention.
Which federal charges
Um,
did she want?
well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
What federal charges are there here?
Yeah,
Well,
what
by
would fit
Monday,
that? Yeah.
exactly. I mean, they were looking at all sorts of stuff that they could come up with. The federal riot statute, the, some other offenses I'd have to go back and look at my notes. But by Monday, it was clearly evident, even to the U.S. Attorney's Office, who was really wanting to do something here, that there was nothing to support a federal charge. But so then it would appear, again, the facts as I know them, and I'm going to inject one piece of opinion here. It would appear that they wanted to do something to show that they were doing something. So what's the climate at this point? Well, just a few months before this, you had the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, state publicly that white supremacy and white nationalism and domestic terrorism and that flavor was the greatest threat to America. And the director of the FBI had parroted that. And you also had this growing push of support from the federal government behind the LGBTQ movement. You had pride flags showing up in federal government offices. The FBI was setting up diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinators amongst all of its offices. So you had these two things going on. Well, by early that week, two different things were happening. One, my FBI headquarters was communicating with me that the FBI was very familiar with the Patriot Front. They'd been investigated for allegations of violence before, and over again were found that this group didn't commit acts of violence, that its leadership didn't permit acts of violence, didn't condone acts of violence, would kick people out of the group for talking about committing acts of violence. They were a lawfully formed group for lawful constitutional purposes of freedom of speech and assembly to go and protest and counter-protest everything from satanic groups to Black Lives Matter to LGBTQ to whatever it is they wanted to protest. They all showed up looking like this. They all showed up with the same stuff that they were found in Coeur d'Alene. And plenty of times they were known to show up in the back of a box truck. So it was, from my headquarters perspective down to my perspective, it was, there's no there. Let's just assist the PD with whatever the PD wants.
Yeah.
Which the PD is now trying to search all of these phones and cameras that they seized. And my communication to the PD was, hey, I'm here to help. I have not opened a predicated case for this. I've just opened an assistance file. If you want our help, we can execute a state warrant for you. Here's the language that needs to be included in it so that we can search it, and we'll do whatever we can for you. And they're like, that's fantastic. Thanks. We got this. But if you could help us dump the 30-some devices that we've got, that would be fantastic. But, and big but here, and this is where the train comes off the tracks, the U.S. Attorney's Office for Idaho and members of the Department of Justice were not willing to accept that. They couldn't charge these guys federally, but now they wanted not a state search warrant for the devices. They wanted to write a federal search warrant for the devices. And in spite of conference calls with me and conference calls that included FBI headquarters saying that there's no there's no evidence to support a federal probable cause statement here under the riot statute. It was, no, we, the U.S. Attorney's Office, are running this investigation, and you can't tell us that we don't have probable cause. We're going to write this warrant. So ultimately they did. And they not only did they do that, but they used the local assistant U.S. attorney here to inject themselves into the the Coeur d'Alene prosecutor's office and say, don't allow the PD to get its own search warrant. So in other words, interfering with the state investigation.
Yeah.
We're going to get a federal search warrant. All right, well, they write it, and that is where, like, they're now including pictures of January 6th, and they're trying to draw a link that this group in Coeur d'Alene is just like every other right-wing extremist group. They're violent. Their motive is violence. Look at them here at January 6th. They're beating up police officers and they're breaking windows. And look, they were found with shields in Coeur d'Alene. Look at what they used shields for at January 6th. They're breaking the windows of the Capitol down. Like, violence. No mention that the FBI had looked at these people before. No mention of all the efforts that the FBI knew that this group went to avoid violence. And they weren't at January. None of these individuals arrested in Coeur d'Alene were under investigation for being at the Capitol on January 6th. And the group was not known to be in DC protesting on January 6th. So again, they were trying to do whatever they could to form that narrative that met the riot statute, that this group came to Coeur d'Alene to commit acts of violence, when the FBI was saying, and my agents that I had assigned to it were saying, there's no evidence to support that. Or there's minimal evidence to support that.
Oh boy.
Um, yeah. So my agents reviewed the U.S. Attorney's Office and DOJ search warrant. Were very uncomfortable with it, but they edited it. But they also communicated to the AUSA and subsequently to me that they were not comfortable swearing that warrant out. That you know there wasn't probable cause here.
Could you explain real
It,
quick to people who don't understand, swearing out a warrant? What does that mean?
yeah. All right. So and this applies at the federal level and at the state
Yep.
level, your Fifth Amendment protections to unreasonable searches and seizures means that your property, your person, your places, you should be secure in them unless a judge has approved a warrant based on probable cause.
Right.
Another term for probable cause is also reasonable belief. In other words, what is common now is that on the federal level and as well in most state levels, a law enforcement officer, in this case, normally FBI agents, would write an affidavit. And the affidavit is simply a regurgitation of the facts of the investigation and say, hey, based on facts A, B, C, D, all the way to whatever, I believe that there is probable cause that this crime was committed and that there is evidence of this crime on these devices. Judge would review those facts, review the accompanying search warrant for it, and if the judge agreed with the statement that all these facts are true because the agent is raising the right hand and swearing to me that they are true, and this agent is swearing to me that they believe there's probable cause here, and I believe there's probable cause here, then the judge will authorize it. So that is an affidavit that accompanies a search warrant based on the standard of probable cause. An agent, all the way down to a police officer, they have to swear to the contents of that being true and accurate to the best of their ability. And whatever statement is included in it, to include, I believe that there's probable cause, is true and accurate to the best of their ability. And if they are found to have lied in that, or that there's purposeful omissions in that, then that search warrant and any evidence that comes from it can be
No good.
suppressed in
Yeah.
court, via a Frank's hearing. And then there's significant repercussions for that law enforcement officer because now they're going to be found to have lied in a court proceeding, and they're going to be what's considered giglio. In other words, they've lied to the court. They cannot be found truthful anymore, and it is going to significantly derail, if not just completely stop, a special agent or a law enforcement officer's career.
Yeah, because if you're on this list of, you were being deceitful or, trying to cook the books or trying to do whatever, where you can't testify in open court, well, what good are you as a
Right.
cop?
Yeah.
Agent, cop, whatever. And we've run into this as well. And our our department, we had similar situations, and their solution was promote them so they don't have to, you know, testify in court. They're not going to get involved in something like that. But what message does that send? But
Sure.
for another day. So you're getting pressure from the U.S. Attorney's Office to have either your agents or you swear this warrant that is incomplete and doesn't have the probable, it doesn't meet that threshold of probable cause, correct?
No, it doesn't meet the threshold of probable cause from my agents that were reviewing it. So that was their job.
Yeah.
But it's also, you know, does it say things in it that are explicitly false? In some cases, yes, but it's also very misleading because it's purposely omitting
Mm.
facts known to the investigators. And you can't do that.
No, you
You can't
can't.
pick and choose
No,
what's
no.
going to be what's supportive of your argument and exclude all the things that are not supportive of your argument of probable cause. So that first draft came through. My agents were uncomfortable with it. They stated to the U.S. attorney or the assistant U.S. attorney that they weren't comfortable with it. They got chewed out on the phone by this assistant U.S. attorney for putting exculpatory information that was counter to their narrative of violence, which made the whole bullpen very uncomfortable because a bunch of other people got to hear that phone call.
Yeah.
So then I tried to inject myself and tried to get my management team to say, hey, enough is enough here. Like, we can't keep pressuring these agents. And, we're going down a very dangerous path with this search warrant. And it's been now 2 weeks since the event. We could just let the PD get their own search warrant. We could have executed a PD search warrant a week ago.
Yeah.
And now we're just stalling everything just to get this federal warrant. but my management wouldn't stand behind me. In spite of emails from FBI headquarters that, no agent should be pressured, despite of emails from FBI headquarters saying, hey, the FBI has a history of agents stating after the fact that they knowingly supported bad warrants because of pressure. And they specifically highlighted the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane as an example of that. The pressure from the U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't coming directly at me. The pressure from the U.S. Attorney's Office was going up to DOJ, up to the Deputy Attorney General's desk, and then coming back down the FBI flagpole. And apparently, nobody within that line had a spine until it hit my desk.
Boy.
So I was ordered to make my agents review a second draft because the attorneys were going to go and wordsmith this affidavit some more.
Yeah.
Nothing you ever want to hear.
No.
Anyway, lawful order, support a redrafting of this warrant. I instructed my agents to do that, and they did. And they answered whatever questions the attorneys had, provided whatever evidence the attorneys wanted, and then reviewed a second draft. And again, told me that they were unwilling to swear to it, that it was not an accurate warrant. They still didn't believe there was probable cause, and it was extremely misleading. And I said, okay, like, that's your job. Go back and do your other job. I will message this up. And I did. And my bureau management wouldn't accept it as an answer. And it was like, well, Zach, then you need to. I said, look, I'm not pressuring these agents anymore. And I'm not going to let you guys do it either. Like, if you want these guys to continue to draft it, you're just telling them they will draft this until they say yes. Like, the facts haven't changed for a month. I mean, okay, Zach, well, you go and find another agent on your squad that will read this and consider if they'll be willing to swear it out. And I just said, no, that is not a good idea. We're not going to do that. That is just asking somebody that doesn't know better to say, hey, this thing reads good. I don't know what is or isn't in it. I don't know if it's missing things. And, not to mention the dynamic in a small satellite office of pitting agents against each other. You got two agents that have worked it for a month saying, like, this is a bad warrant, dude, don't do it. And you got another agent saying, like, oh, it reads well, I guess I can do it. I wasn't willing to put my agents in that position.
Right.
My management went around me anyway, and then subsequently removed me from my supervisory position.
So, I mean, it was almost like parent shopping. Anybody who has little kids, it's like,
sure.
Dad says, no, I'm going to try mom. I want that piece of chocolate cake, damn it. And that's a very simplistic, explanation. But, it's a fishing expedition. And the big thing is the facts of this case did not change. And, they're trying to bend it and trying to, shop it around. And it is what it is. And it's like this group of individuals that, they're going after, maybe they're the biggest assholes on planet Earth, but there's no law against being an asshole.
No, there isn't. And that's a point I've tried to make in all my interviews, that I don't support the Patriot Front. I do think they're a bunch of assholes or a bunch of idiots. But that isn't against the law. And whether or not you agree with someone's opinion or their stance cannot be the litmus test as to whether or not you, as federal law enforcement, believe that constitutional protections apply. Again, this is, day one stuff at any law enforcement academy.
Yes,
but to have it all cast aside and thrown out the window because of political expedience and pressure was just unbelievable bullshit. And it was mind-blowing for me at the time. Just mind-blowing. Still mind-blowing for me. But I couldn't understand why my management team wouldn't get behind me with this. It wouldn't support my agents on this. But the U.S. Attorney's Office had done a really good job of running their message of, we've got a problem with the Bureau and we need to get this done, all the way up to the Deputy Attorney General's desk. And that pressure came right back down the Bureau flagpole, and nobody was willing to stop it.
Wow. Now you made a formal complaint against the U.S. Attorney's Office, didn't you?
Yeah. So after I was removed from the case, I filed a quote unquote official whistleblower complaints against the U.S. Attorney's Office, the attorneys responsible for this at DOJ, and then my executive management team. Because when it was removed from me, it was given to another supervisor who had pledged her support for this affidavit before she'd ever read it, before she even knew who wrote it. And she swore it out herself and has perjured herself significantly at this point. So I knew all that was happening. And again, that's wrong. It's abuse of power. It's abuse of authority.
Yep.
It's efforts to suborn perjury. And I reported that up to DOJ, OIG. And then as time went on, after I was physically removed from the office, I also reported it to the director and I reported it to Congress.
So what happened after that?
Um, so oddly enough, like literally days before this event in June, I received a mid-year performance check-in that was, roses. Zach has got an excellent grip on FBI leadership competencies. He's already achieved many of his performance objectives for the year. He's got great relationships with his state and local counterparts. So that's the 1st of June. Well, the 1st of August, suddenly I'm failing everything, literally failing all performance competence and objectives. And I was walked out of my office 2 days later. And I've been warned that they were coming, and they did. What I know now that I didn't know at the time was I was removed on a Friday. The next Monday, my management team was referring me to FBI Security Division, trying to get my clearance pulled, referring me to Insider Threat Section, was referring me to Human Resources Division to try to get me transferred. Like, it was game on for two reasons, I believe. This is my opinion. One, to punish me for what I did because I'd embarrassed them, and two, to cover up what they did. They knew what they did was wrong, forcing this warrant through. I don't think they had any clue how tenaciously I was willing to fight, and that I was not going to crumble under all the pressure they put me under. But ultimately, they walked me out of my office, separated me from my team, told me I couldn't communicate to my team anymore, sent me home, and then they sent me to West Virginia and separated me from my family. And then they immediately followed that up with a loss of effectiveness transfer request, where they just, it was an unbelievable personal attack, calling me everything under the sun, biased, a liar. I was toxic. I couldn't communicate. I couldn't work with women. And just the list went on and on and on and on and on. But their argument ultimately led to I'd ruined all these relationships in North Idaho, and no one would work with the FBI anymore because of me. And the only solution was to get rid of me. All that, led me to reaching out to all my local counterparts and said, hey, this is how I'm being described. This is what I'm going through in generalities. If you guys want to write your own letters describing in your own words what it was like to work with me, or how you know me, or how you see me, I will use those as my rebuttal. And I sent almost 40 letters in as my rebuttal. And ultimately, the transfer was denied by FBI headquarters. Salt Lake Division, my management in Salt Lake, tried to bring me to Salt Lake City and put me on a performance improvement plan. Mm-hmm. But they had no evidence to base that performance improvement plan on. So that too was denied by headquarters. But instead, headquarters opened an internal investigation into me and my agents, and hammered that hard for a year, and ultimately used that for my dismissal. And I was told during my appeal brief, that my judgment in not instructing my agents to take a more aggressive tact to investigate this group was poor and rose to the level of severe misconduct.
Now, at this point in time, did upper level or executive level management know the outcome of this case, or was it still ongoing?
By the time I was dismissed, the misdemeanor cases were all settled. So it was all known. And it was also known, again, whether or not it was known to the deputy director of the FBI, that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office were hiding this affidavit from the locals. I don't know. I don't have evidence to say one way or the other. Yeah. But the cases were all done at that point by the time I was removed. And I used that as part of my rebuttal of like,
right, because for the most part, it wound up being a whole big nothing. Because it was a big nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the FBI case was a nothing burger. Right. So, but it didn't matter. Again, it was all the way back to that lesson you learned day one at FBI Academy. You don't embarrass the Bureau. And if the Bureau wants to screw you, it will do so.
So, from a local point of view, we had, unions. There's a police officer union, there's a supervisors union. So if something like this was going on, I had somebody to turn to, and if they would take the case, there was union attorneys that would start going to bat for you. Did you have anything like that?
Sure. So there's no union on the federal side for law enforcement, but what we do have is the FBI Agents Association, which is a voluntary organization that's private. It's formed by FBI agents, and in large part, it is there to have kind of a pot of money to provide support to somebody going through hard times. Maybe they had a spouse die.
Okay.
We've got a college fund for children of agents who died in the line of duty. Their
Yeah,
college is going to be paid for in the future.
that
We
makes
also
sense.
have attorneys that we pay for to provide legal assistance for administrative matters. So they provided me with an attorney during that internal investigation. But they also kind of have an internal lobbying arm where the leadership structure of the Agents Association can message issues up the chain of command within the FBI. And I always had them in my corner, and they messaged it up to the deputy director, and it went nowhere. If anything, it probably embarrassed the Bureau more that I had all these people continuing to support me
Yeah.
throughout this. Even went so far that every field office has a rep for the FBI Agents Association. Again, it's a private entity, and there's an election amongst all the members. So if you assume that every FBI agent is generally a member of the Agents Association, well, in the Salt Lake City division, they will every 2 years they will elect their representative to be a part of the Agents Association Council. Well, somebody put my name forward, and all the members of Salt Lake Division, when I was persona non grata and my name was not to be spoken of in the halls of the FBI in Salt Lake, elected me as their Agents Association rep. And my opinion, again, is that was a giant middle finger to
Oh,
both the
absolutely.
management in Salt Lake and executive management in
In
the
Washington.
bureau
Yeah.
up at Washington. But again, I think you never embarrass the bureau. All of that's embarrassing to them. Doesn't they're never going to change. At that point, they were in so deep they couldn't change tact. And there is that attitude that was shared with me of screw him, fire him, let him sue his way back in. He'll learn his lesson. And everybody else out there that watches this will learn that you don't stand up to the bureau.
So you were terminated, and
Yes.
how did they terminate you? Like, how did they physically do this?
So I was in February of 2024, I was recalled into the Coeur d'Alene office, and I was served with my letter of proposed dismissal, which means, hey, the Bureau is going to consider you've been proposed for firing, but you've got your appeal process to go through. But at that point, I was stripped of everything. So I had to turn in my gun, my badge, my credentials, credit
Okay.
card, all of my government property, and told that I could not conduct myself as a federal agent anymore. However, Human Resources Division chose to keep me in paid administrative leave status,
Hmm.
conceivably because I was a veteran and I had preference eligible. But the Bureau is very selective when it does that. And I know of other people that were veterans and had preference eligible status that were not afforded that. So again, was that certain people in the FBI looking out for me in ways that they could without putting themselves in a bad light? Maybe.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I remained in that paid administrative status until August when I received a FedEx letter that said I was done.
A
No
FedEx letter.
call, no
Oh my
call,
God.
no conversation in the office. It was a letter that says, Zach, as of this date, as of the opening of this letter, you're officially terminated from the roles of the FBI, and your pay and benefits end today.
How many years did you have in with the FBI at that point?
16.
Okay. And what do you need for a full pension? 20?
20 in law enforcement. So I have 20 with my Air Force time, but to retire with a law enforcement pension, you have to have a minimum of 20 years and be 50 years of age. And I just turned 46. So I was
Okay.
short on both counts.
Man, yeah, it just strikes me. It's like, okay, right, wrong, or indifferent. If you're going to dismiss somebody, you got to have the balls to stand in front of them and say, you know what? You're no longer a member of this club, etc. And just do it the right way because that sends a message, I think, other than a rather than a FedEx envelope saying that
Sure.
you're done. I mean, like I said, have the balls to stand up in front of that person is like, you know what, this is why we're doing it. I'm sorry it had to end this way, but this is what I believe, etc. But instead, it's literally hiding in a corner. It's like a little child cowering in a corner because there might be confrontation or nobody likes firing somebody. Nobody likes that. I
Yeah,
was
it's
a
not
boss
fun.
for years and disciplining your cops was not a fun thing. That was my least favorite thing to do. But it had to be done and you had to at least show them that respect.
Yeah. one would like to think, right?
Yeah, I mean, you
Um,
put in 16 years, so you know what? At least respect that for God's sakes. But
it's funny, when I was walked out of the office in February, the Salt Lake Division SAC, which was a different SAC than what had been there when all this had originally gone down, came up and was there when I had to sign the paperwork and be read out of my security clearance, et cetera. Well, they had let all the employees effectively go from the office, but they had a conference call with them after I had been dismissed or proposed for dismissal. And it's funny, her comments to everybody from what got back to me was praising me for my professionalism and how I handled being walked out of the office. Um, but I was fired for unprofessional conduct.
uh,
So
God,
again, you know, um, if the Bureau wants to screw you, it will find a way. It just
yeah,
is what it is. It's an
wow,
unfortunate nature of the beast. I happen to find myself in the middle of a very politically charged set of circumstances. And here we are. I continue to fight and we're going to see what happens.
yeah, well, let me ask you this: if you were pardoned or if you won your appeal, because well, let's go right now. It's like, are you in the middle of an appeal process, or can you say where you are with all this?
Yeah, I am still in an appeal process, but I'm still in multiple administrative courts in my complaints against the government. And my attorneys and I are considering whether or not now is the time to go into federal court with some of those complaints. Um, Time will tell.
Okay,
I certainly have my advocates that are communicating my name up to the current administration and leadership of the FBI and DOJ, and we'll see what happens. At a minimum, whether or not I stay for another 4 years or whatever in the FBI, I should be afforded that choice. I
yes,
should not have all of that taken from me, and I certainly shouldn't be fired for upholding my oath, protecting my employees, and ensuring the constitutional protections that American citizens are due.
right.
Um,
And the thing about it is, you're providing excellent leadership. From this whole story, it's like, okay, this is what a leader should do. Even, you're doing the right thing. At the end of the day, you have to wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror. It's like, okay, did I do the right thing? Did I throw my guys or gals under the bus to make myself look better? Did I put them in a position that potentially might cost them their jobs, or or black marks on their employee records, or whatever the case may be? That's the burden of leadership. It's like, I'm going to put it all on my shoulders. And you did.
sure,
It would have been super easy to say, just sign the freaking warrant. All right. Let's just be done with this. But you did the right thing. And, and not to sound too corny, but we're here to uphold the Constitution. It's that simple. That's our playbook. And boy, it's so
very much.
disheartening that your executive and, management just ignores that, and just for the sake of politics. And it is supercharged in politics, and it sucks. I'm sorry. But let me go here. If you were pardoned or you won your appeal, would you go back to the FBI?
The short answer is yes. There's obviously a massive, BUT that follows that.
Yes.
I've been through the ringer, but my family's been through the ringer.
Oh, absolutely.
And, so what that is going to look like, I've got to get through the door to find out. So would
Okay.
I go back to the FBI? Yes, I would go back to the FBI. But what that's going to look like and whether or not, I would stay um, is to be determined.
Okay. All right. So let me ask you this. What advice would you give someone today who would want to be an FBI agent after everything that's happened to you?
Loaded question. I still
Yeah.
believe in the mission of the FBI, and I think the FBI has the best mission of all of the federal law enforcement agencies. Um, my encouragement to those folks that are looking at going into the FBI is be prepared to break the cultural norm that go into the FBI, but don't feel like you're obligated to stay there for an entire career. Go in, do a good thing. And if you have other opportunities that you want to pursue, or you come across things that you don't like about the organization, then leave comfortably. You're quickly indoctrinated that, you come to the FBI for a career and you never leave until you retire, at least on the agent side.
Right.
And I think that is part of what leads to a toxic environment because folks are scared to leave. They're scared to lose that pension. But you come to the FBI and do 4 years of great work and then go on and do something else. You always were an FBI agent. You always have that. You have that experience and you did good things while you were there. And the Bureau needs real cultural change from a leadership model. And I keep touting this, and I hope somebody out there that is in a position to make these moves, at the director level is listening. Lots of folks have asked, like, what could have prevented this? Well, procedures and policies can't prevent all this because there was plenty of policies that were broken along the way.
Right.
And, anybody that's been in government long enough knows that, there's an exemption to every policy. And policy at the end of the day is really only there to hang the guy at the bottom or the gal at the bottom when you want to, or once they've violated it. It's culture that needs to change. It's a culture that, all of the people that were above me that could have said no to this would have had the spine and the support organizationally and culturally to say no to this. I think that cultural investment takes a lot of time. It has to be clearly defined and it has to be invested in. It needs to be invested in now to be able to have dividends 20 or 30 years from now.
Right.
There are institutions in the federal government that have good culture. Look at the Marine Corps, for example.
Sure.
Very strong culture. Is it perfect? It isn't perfect. But it's also looked at one of the strongest leadership cultures in the U.S. government. Now, is the FBI going to become the Marine Corps? No, it most definitely is not. But it takes a commitment to that culture to be able to affect change and to be able to have folks empowered to do the right thing. Because you're not empowered to do the right thing if you stand up and then just get mowed over by the tide. You can still look at yourself in the mirror, but you're covered in seaweed, you're all beat up. And as my wife said when I got walked out, when you fall on a sword for real, it cuts you. Now, I can look myself in the mirror because of that, but it was a very painful road. And I would never dissuade somebody from not voting their conscience, not doing the right thing. But the problem with the Bureau is our culture has been, if that right thing isn't advantageous to the executive management or viewed as advantageous to the organization as a whole, it's going to hurt you as the individual.
So how can we help you? Is there a way that
I think
we can help?
Just spreading the story, man. I think,
Yeah.
again, it's important for the American people to have faith in their government institutions, and it has to be earned. Wrongdoing needs to be treated as wrongdoing, and there needs to be accountability. I continue to communicate with the Senate Judiciary Committee about open testimony there. There is no such thing as whistleblower protections for FBI agents. There just isn't. The FBI has been in flagrant violation of congressional guidelines of whistleblower protection. What leverage does Congress have over that? Well, at the moment, Congress and the executive are somewhat in line because you've got the Republicans in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. Now is the time to institute some of those changes.
Yeah.
It needs to happen.
Yes. I had Peter Fercelli on my show. He was with the ATF and he was a whistleblower for Operation Fast and Furious.
Yeah.
And he testified before Congress and it actually worked out good for him. I'm sure there was blowback, but he continued a very good career after doing that. But, a border agent died because of a cover up.
Yeah.
So, there's no backstepping that. And if there are, and who knows, if there are executive, and even if you're thinking about being in management, the more you cover shit up, the worse it gets. It'll always come to light and it will bite you in the ass. Hopefully in this life or another one. I don't know how these people do it, but yeah. Anyways, let's start wrapping this up. Is there a book in your future?
Maybe, it's definitely not like it's not being drafted right now. However, I have, my appeal of all this is like 800 pages. So I certainly have
I think you got a good base there,
that
buddy.
Book. Yeah.
Or
so,
books.
I would say yes. Like when I think about writing a book, I just don't want a book to be a boohoo story of
right, exactly.
Getting mowed over by the Bureau. It should be, a turd sandwich, right?
Yep.
You've got the good stuff on one side, you got the crap in the middle, and you got the good stuff on the other side. And I'm still fighting to get to the good stuff on the other side. I will get there.
Yes, you will.
it's a question of what that looks like, but I will get myself and my family there. And that's what makes the story. Right now, it's the boohoo story of, yeah, rah, rah, I rural Montana, fought in our wars, had a great time in the Bureau, and then got crushed by it. The story is going to be beyond that boohoo of getting crushed by the Bureau, of overcoming those odds, overcoming those obstacles, and making something, the Bureau, our country, some version of our community, a better place for that. And the book will be an opportunity to communicate that to people, however I decide to try to craft that. For now, it's trying to work with folks such as yourself to try to just orally communicate this story
Okay.
so that people understand the wrongdoing and that it can't be ignored. Because at the end of the day, this is unfortunately much of it is about politics. And this needs a political solution so that I don't have to spend the next 4 years in court to reach a legal conclusion.
Yeah. So is there a website or an email address or anything like that where people can contact you if they want to, or?
Probably my social media stuff is the easiest. It's just
Okay.
Zach Schoffstall. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on X. Folks
Okay.
can find me and follow me and message me there.
Perfect.
Anytime I do these podcasts or have articles come out, I post them there.
Okay. Very good. Anything else you want to add before we sign off?
Patrick, I just really appreciate the opportunity. Folks such as yourself and Murphy are the ones, continuing to support me in this struggle, and we will overcome. Good will overcome.
Yeah,
So thank you for that.
I have to believe that as well. And one little thing that, if you're in the middle of something like this, I can't overstate the value of documenting everything that happens.
Mhm.
On date,
Absolutely.
time, this is what, and be incredibly specific. Go home, have your steno pad ready, and just start writing, man. You need to document this stuff.
Absolutely. No, that can't be overstated that you got to have good documentation.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Zach, thank you so much for being on the show. Please keep in touch. You have people in your corner. I know you do. And just keep fighting the good fight.
I will do just that, Patrick, and thank you for the opportunity.
You bet.